The Leadership Institute trained 11,632 students last year, an almost 25% increase from the enrollment in '08, which was a 33% increase over the enrollment in '07. In 2010, the Institute has already trained 1,510, and since 1979, the Institute has trained a grand total of 82,094 people, most of them students. You have before you our current 2010 school schedule. We have more schools scheduled at this time in this year than we have ever had at this time in any previous year, and I believe it is still true to say we have more students pre-registered at our schools than we have ever had pre-registered at this time in any previous year. I urge you to take a moment to review our upcoming schools and consider attending one or sending a friend. And now it is my pleasure to introduce to you Giselle. Is it Giselle or Giselle? Giselle. Giselle. Yes. Like Giselle McKinsey. You've heard that? Giselle McKinsey. Y'all remember Giselle McKinsey on your hit parade on television? Giselle McKinsey. There are a number of heads nodding that you remember that. Giselle is an intern and works currently in the recruitment department of the Leadership Institute. She graduated from James Madison University, which college Helen had the honor to serve on the Board of Visitors for a term. Giselle graduated in May of last year with a BA in History. During her time at JMU, she was secretary of the Middle Eastern Interest Club and an active member of the school's College Republicans, and she intends next fall to attend law school. Would you come, please, and offer an invocation and lead us in the pledge?
Thank you, Morton, and good morning, everybody. If we can all bow our heads for prayer, please. This prayer is called, May We Draw Closer. Eternal God, in whose name we have gathered, lift our thoughts that we may renew our minds, and lead us to a sense of your presence, that we may restore our souls. As we conclude this prayer, we thank you, O Lord, for our hallowed memories and for our abiding hopes. Help us to show that we are truly your children by giving ourselves faithfully to your tasks. Help us to convert our convictions into conduct, to narrow the gap between our principles and our practices. Keep us from seeking excuses for our shortcomings and to help us to heal any wounds we may inflict. Help us to carry our successes with humility and to face our disappointments with courage and faith. Keep us from the pride that blinds the mind and from the anger that hardens the heart. Make us loyal to your convictions in the face of falsehood. Help us to speak the truth in love. May the prayers we have offered here today draw us closer to our heritage, draw us closer to each other, and draw us closer to you. And now will you all rise for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you.
Giselle, I have to tell you that when Giselle McKinsey was singing on television with the hit parade, the top 10 songs on the hit parade in those days were actually melodic. You could sing them, and the lyrics you could quote to your grandmother without being embarrassed. Now my pleasure to introduce Eric Slee, who will give us a report on our programs, and it'll be 2 or 3 minutes long. Eric is currently the director of the Communications Training Department at the Leadership Institute. He was previously a legislative correspondent for Congressman Mark Green of Wisconsin's 8th Congressional District. Eric was raised in Watertown, Wisconsin, and graduated from the University of Wisconsin at Oshkosh, receiving a bachelor's degree in political science. Eric?
Thank you, Morton. Big fan of the hit parade myself. I don't know what that is. Good morning. Not that you can see. Good morning, everyone. I just wanted to quickly give you an update on the Leadership Institute's success at CPAC. It was a great event for us all this year. And before I tell you what we did at CPAC, let me just quickly tell you how we did what we did at CPAC, and take this moment to recognize a staff member who has probably done more for the organization to raise our profile at CPAC and really strengthen our relationship with the American Conservative Union, who puts on this conference every year. Mary Kane serves as a CPAC steering committee member who plans out just about every detail of what we do at this conference. So I wanted to quickly give her a round of applause for a job well done. And thank you, Mary. I believe she's out in the kitchen somewhere. She also does the breakfast every month, so she's very busy. So very quickly, CPAC 2010 was the most well-attended CPAC in the history of the conference, correct? With over 10,000 members attending from all 50 states. Even though we had to compete against some of the most revered names in right-of-center circles, such as Mike Pence, Marco Rubio, and a surprise appearance by Dick Cheney, which I threw in there for the libertarians in the room. LI was able to train 497 conservatives from all around the country, exposing them, a lot of them first-time training attendees to CPAC, or to Leadership Institute programs. So they're really, their eyes were open to what we do here, how we assist the larger conservative movement with training young individuals and candidates and activists from all over the country, how to better carry forward the fight that conservatives and libertarians are going to face in the coming election cycle and throughout elections every year. As I mentioned, 497 students were trained. Public speaking workshop, which I managed, trained 126 individuals, so that made it the most highly attended training that we put on. And as one student commented, if you're an activist, pundit, potential candidate, you need to participate in this workshop, just demonstrating how beneficial some of these kids thought their trainings were for them at CPAC. We also hosted the 4th annual job fair, which had 585 participants. Megan Parlett manages the job fair. She did a fantastic job. And as one recruiter commented, it's plain to see that you're running a well-organized, effective placement program for LI and the movement as a whole. Congrats on another excellent job fair. Not only beneficial for us, but also other organizations who are looking for talented, qualified, conservative folks to work for those organizations. So overall, our presence at CPAC was well accepted, well received, and the Institute's name recognition is going through the roof in some of these conservative circles now, thanks to our appearance and performance at CPAC. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Eric. You did a great job. I happened to attend the public speaking workshop which we put on at CPAC, and it was particularly satisfying that as we came up to the time to start, we had a room nicely filled with chairs. They filled up. We had to bring in some more chairs. More people came. We had to bring in some more chairs. Bringing in chairs twice is a marvelous technique. I know you planned it well. It made everybody very excited about that. And after we'd put in literally all the chairs that we could in the room, there were standing room at the event. It was great. And now it is my pleasure to produce David Hempel, who will introduce our outstanding speaker, who happens to have been a friend of mine since 1968. David is currently the Assistant Controller at the Leadership Institute. He has his conceal and carry permit, and I can tell you he doesn't always conceal, but he always carries. David is a member of Gun Owners. He and our speaker affirmed that this morning at breakfast. David is a 2006 graduate of Liberty University in Lynchburg. Before attending college, David volunteered in a number of state and local campaigns in his home state of New Jersey, and later volunteered for the Bush-Cheney 2004 72-hour task force. David interned with us here at the Leadership Institute in the spring of 2006 and joined the staff at the end of the year. Come introduce our speaker, David.
Thank you, Morton. Our speaker, Larry Pratt, has been Executive Director of Gun Owners of America for 26 years. GOA is a national membership organization of 300,000 Americans dedicated to promoting and defending our Second Amendment freedom to keep and bear arms. GOA lobbies for this position in Washington and in the States. Mr. Pratt has appeared on national radio and TV channels including ABC, CBS, the conservative bastion CNN, and Fox News. He has debated Congressman James Traficant Jr., Congressman Charles Rangel, and Vice President Al Gore, among others. In 1990, he published a book called Armed People Victorious, and in 2001 published another book called On the Firing Line, Essays in the Defense of Liberty. He has also served as a member of the House of Delegates in the Commonwealth of Virginia. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Pratt to the Institute.
Kind of neat to be in a room that is probably one of the most secure in the whole area here in Northern Virginia. Thank you, David. And I suspect there may be a few others. There's no teleprompter here. And I didn't bring my notes. Oh, well, that'll cut it short, which is very merciful. The traffic is really bad this morning, and I'm absolutely flattered and honored that so many of you would be here in spite of it. Had I not been speaking, I think I would have turned around and gone home. It was really miserable. I suspect it's apocryphal, but I read about one of the continuing indoctrination programs in the government schools, and it told of a teacher that was asking her students if how many of them supported the president, President Obama. And students raised their hands, and one of them didn't. She said, "Johnny, you don't support Mr. Obama?" "No, I don't." "Well, why not?" "Well, my daddy's a Republican, and my mama's a Republican, and I'm a Republican." "Well, Johnny, if your daddy were an idiot and your mama were a moron, what would that make you?" "An Obama supporter." So you better know the answer to the questions when you ask them, and the president's, I think, been finding that out lately. The key word in the Second Amendment issue, I have concluded over the years, is sovereignty. We have guns because we're the boss. The American people founded this government in this land. We, the people, do hereby ordain and establish. And that means that the folks in Washington and in Richmond and Arlington work for us. Now, sometimes they have trouble remembering that, and that's why we have guns. It's not very politically correct to say that, but frankly, they have a lot more respect for the American people because they know that if they ever awaken us, that's always on the shelf. And they have been awakening us lately, I think. And hopefully we're going to take care of business in the ballot box where it's easiest to take care of it. But the concept is so antithetical to the experience of most politicians who assume that they're in charge. During the run-up to our war for independence, the Brits did a lot of things to irritate us. And we've all been told how it was a tax rebellion. And it's true, we didn't like what they were doing in that regard. But what really got folks chapped was the confiscation of the registered guns that the people of Boston, even then, were silly enough to cooperate with, followed by the banning of importation of guns and ammo into the colonies. And finally, they knew that the line had been drawn when militia meetings, which were sanctioned by law, these were not pickup groups, these were colonial legislative chartered groups. When those were being suppressed, it drove, in 1775, it drove George Mason, and I think this group probably knows who George Mason was, but he was a great defender of the Bill of Rights, a neighbor and friend of George Washington, and especially interested in the Second Amendment. It drove him to write that we needed a well-regulated militia. And of course, if you just look at that isolated phrase in the light of today's thinking, then you might conclude that, well, that means that the government is supposed to be doing the regulating, because who else does regulating except the government? And that when we think that way, it means we've forgotten entirely that we're the boss. But he went on to explain, just in case a 21st century reader didn't get it, he went on to explain that a well-regulated militia represents the embodiment of the power of the people. So they were pretty clear back then what it was all about. This whole issue was debated from our pulpits at that time, and it had been for some probably 20 years. And to probably oversimplify, the debate had been reduced to what did it mean in Romans 13 when it said that all souls are subject to the higher powers or the higher authority. And when the kings looked at that, they said, well, that's me. I'm the word. I'm the last word. I'm the law. And I guess it might have been one response that folks might have said, oh, so you don't have a soul, because it says all souls are subject to the higher authority. And actually, the point was that, yeah, even the king is subject to higher authority, the law of God. And even in Britain, not to mention the United States with its Constitution, there was a long train of constitutional establishment. It was the Magna Carta that had been enacted back in the 13th century, particularly dealing with jury trial, which was another thing that was being trampled on by the Crown in the 1770s. And the Bill of Rights of 1689, which William and Mary had to sign before they were allowed to become king and queen. That protected the right to keep and bear arms. And then, of course, all the colonial charters. Those were contracts. Those, as contracts, could not be unilaterally broken, which they were being broken by the Crown. Now, this is interesting history because this is what established our country, and doesn't it sound like I'm reading the newspapers? This long train of abuses that so irritated our founding fathers and their generation is the same basic train of abuses. Imagine, we're in court right now, yesterday actually were the arguments, to determine if the Supreme Court might recognize that there is a right to keep and bear arms that exists outside of a federal enclave. Really? That's what George Washington spent that miserable winter in Valley Forge for? so that a bunch of his employees could determine the terms and if he could have a firearm? Sure. Now, I think we're going to win the narrow point in that lawsuit, but folks, we shouldn't be there. It's just, there's something desperately wrong when we're having to plead for a little bit of our basic right as sovereign. And if we don't address our employees in a proper fashion, they're going to continue to ride roughshod over us. I think we're seeing a shift, and it's been ongoing even before the current Tea Parties and town halls. We've seen last year the passage of legislation in 2 of the states, and it's probably going to be followed by several others. Legislation that says that if a gun is made in the state and it's identified as having been made in the state and it stays in the state, which is a curtsy to the overextension of the Commerce Clause, which has been one of the engines of federal tyranny, then the gun is subject to no federal firearms law whatsoever. That means you don't have to prove your innocence before you buy a gun. Imagine. It might actually appear to be a right. I'm talking about the instant background check, in case I'm not being clear. We should not have to convince the government that we are innocent. That's the burden on the government. And when you have a right, you don't have your employee telling you that you can exercise it. And so we are seeing really under the rubric of the 10th Amendment, a pushback that is long overdue and I think is beginning to sweep the country. Even before the Firearms Freedom Acts, which it may go to a dozen states this year that actually put it on their books, we've seen the nullification of the national ID card. Enough states nullified that nannyism that would have affected gun owners because it would have enabled your driver's license to have all kinds of private data on it. And we know how well the government protects data. You know, you read almost every other week about computers going missing from one of the government agencies, but then they don't really care because it's just their property. I mean, I'm speaking about you and me. So they're really not too concerned about that. They're pretty sloppy. And yet they wanted to have a national ID card that would have had all this even more centralized than it already is. So many states said, we're going to put our crats in jail if they cooperate with you, that the law is DOA. The sanctions that were to have gone into effect over 3 years ago have not been implemented. Had they been implemented, you and I, as Virginia residents, wouldn't have been able to get on a plane with our driver's license, wouldn't have been able to buy a gun with our driver's license. And the state said, take a walk. That's a pretty healthy development. We're seeing it in the area of socialized medicine, which the narcissist in chief wants to cram down our throats. And already Virginia has said, not in our backyard. And there are a lot of other states, I think, that are going to do that this year. So we've got a very healthy development here where finally, at the state level, politicians are rediscovering their responsibility and beginning to operate as if the 10th Amendment means what it says, which basically says that any power that is not delegated specifically in the Constitution's main body to the United States then is reserved to the people and or the states. And that is probably even more important than the Second Amendment. We shouldn't need the Second Amendment because there's no power in the Constitution given to the United States to regulate guns. So all of that power in Washington in that area is unconstitutional. And if you're looking for ways to save money and reduce the deficit, there's one. There's a whole lot of others, actually. If we took the Constitution seriously, and if when people raised their hand and promised to uphold the Constitution, if they really meant it, our property values of your house and mine, Morton, would go down substantially, something that I devoutly hope to see happen. We'll see how far the 10th Amendment movement takes us. There was a backdoor effort, even in the health legislation, to get at guns. The Democrats have learned something, and it'd be interesting if the Republicans could ever learn the same lesson. The Democrats learned in 1994 that guns is a no-no. You just don't go there. Now, if you can get the pro-gun lobby to agree with you, or if you can bring something in through the back door, that's okay. Then they'll go ahead and do it. But they want to make sure that they are running cover under either the gun lobby or the Republican Party. And that was something that they were doing pretty well with health legislation. And we hollered all last year about this thing. And we said, you know, there's two major areas of great concern. And if you don't address those, then just as gun owners, forget any other concerns, we got a real problem with socializing medicine. But of course, that's the problem with socialism. It usually doesn't stop in just one area. Specifically, we had a problem analogous to Bart Stupak's. He was concerned that there was nothing prohibiting abortion from being compelled in the legislation, and unhappily, we're in a time when if you don't tell your public employee not to do something, then he thinks he can do it, that silence is permission. He's got it completely upside down, but that's the way he thinks. And so the Stupak Amendment was designed to block that, keep that from happening. We had an analogous problem because looking at Mrs. Sebelius in particular, the former governor of Kansas who had vetoed concealed carry legislation, we knew that one of the things she was likely to do was to say, gun ownership is really dangerous behavior, like being a fatty. And we're going to jack up your insurance premiums if you're engaging in that kind of dangerous behavior. How would we know that you are a gun owner? Well, we'd compel registration of guns, something that the anti-self-defense forces have been after for a long time, and here you would have it to protect the women and the children. It was just so wonderful. And there were senators writing back to our folks saying, we don't know where Gun Owners of America is getting that. The word gun's not in the bill, and neither was abortion. And Christmas Eve, we got a little early Christmas present, not everything we wanted, but Harry Reid, in his umpteenth iteration of the nationalization of medicine measure, had some pages in his bill that put the lie to the senators who were saying we didn't know what we were talking about. And he took that ink and those dead trees to explain that all of this possibility could not occur, that this was prohibited, that you could not raise the rates on gun owners and you could not register guns. But we still had another area of great concern, and he was silent on that. And that was what we had dubbed when it was in the Congress, the Veterans Disarmament Act. It says that if you've been diagnosed with a mental problem, post-traumatic stress disorder, something like that, then you are right then and there flat out of luck, no right to keep and bear arms. And if they find out that you have guns, you will get a knock on the door, which had actually been happening to veterans as the Veterans Administration had been computerizing records, medical records, and sending them over to the FBI so that this instant background check could pick them up. And they were getting denied for their concealed carry permit renewals, which is one of the reasons why we shouldn't have to have a permit to begin with, why it should be like Vermont and Alaska, which recognizes carry and concealed or openly as a matter of right. But they weren't getting their permits renewed, and they were actually getting knocks on the door. We had dubbed it the Veterans Disarmament Act because it was hitting them first, but actually the language of the legislation, which Bush signed in early '08, was designed to go after anybody with such a medical diagnosis. And with the government stimulus measure, and I chose those words deliberately because the only thing that the stimulus stimulated was government. There were $20 billion in there. They're serious. I mean, even in Obama's world, that's, you know, at least a petty cash. $20 billion to computerize all medical records. Says something about perhaps dealing in cash when you go for, especially a mental service. There was actually a psychiatrist on a television interview that said that he got so fed up with all the paperwork that he just dropped out of Medicare, insurance, felt that that would probably hurt his business. He was prepared to go into another line of work for IT or whatever it might be to make up his lost income, but he was going to just jack up his rates, forget about all this insurance, and see what happens. Well, what happened was that he never had so much business. When people realized that he was off paper, then when you had an addled teenager, that's the place to take them, because then they're not going to have a record. So that when they go to join the military at age 18 or buy a gun or later join a profession, they wouldn't be proscribed. And it's interesting that even in a major urban area, there were plenty of people that understood the value of privacy. So maybe us gun owners aren't the only ones that are a little paranoid, you know. So that is a problem in the medical legislation, and all of the versions that has not been dealt with. And it means that the medical privacy acts that we live under would continue to do nothing to stop law enforcement from trolling through medical records. And of course, under nationalized medicine, there would be no going to a doctor and just paying cash on the barrel. So we've continued to oppose this just as a Second Amendment issue, but isn't it interesting that that's the way the anti-gunners proceed? They're pretty good at concealment. They believed in concealed carry too. When you lobby, it seems to me, and happily Morton makes available to everybody that comes through the program, I think, the confrontational politics. This is something that's really tough for, generally speaking, nice people that conservatives are to get their heads around. That politics is a war. And it's a war especially because the socialists that we battle see it that way. They want everything. They may not be using guns mostly at the moment, although they do send gun toters out to take away homeschoolers or people that own guns in ways that they didn't think were appropriate. But generally speaking, it's not a war. It's not like a battlefield yet. And maybe it won't if we keep them under control through these primaries and into November. But the left has always focused on the end game, which was total annihilation of freedom and us. And meanwhile, we think this is a Sunday school picnic. And we're out there making nice. I'll give you an example. In 1996, there was a measure before the Senate, and an amendment was offered by then Senator Bob Smith of New Hampshire. It wasn't really a big deal. He was just telling the sovereign that he didn't think he was that sovereign, and that we ought to be able to sue the FBI if we thought they had been abusing the instant background check system to keep a registry of our names. As Smith was going out to the floor, to put this up, some pro-gun senators and the NRA were imploring him not to put this amendment up because the vote count showed that there were only 40 votes. And a loss would be just terrible. We'd never recover from it. Don't do anything like that, please. And so I got a call in my office, and it was Senator Smith. And he said, this is what's going on. What do you think I should do? And I said, well, we don't have a vote count. Frankly, sir, I don't put too much stock in them because I know this is a news flash to you, but a lot of your colleagues are liars. And what they're doing is playing a mind game with you. They're hoping that by telling you they don't know how they're going to vote or they're going to vote against you on this, that you just won't put it up, and therefore they won't have to go on record. But if you put it up and they have to go on record, I'm almost certain that you're going to prevail just because they don't want to go back home. This was after 1994, and so we knew that there were a lot of these professing born-againers that weren't really for real, but they were talking the talk. And so I said, if you put that up, we'll have a political record, win, lose, or draw, that we can use in campaigns. And you're going to be our hero, and that's what we're going to tell the world. That's all I wanted to know. So he went over and indeed forced the vote. It was a recorded vote, and he didn't get 40 votes. He got 67. There were 27 liars that day alone in the United States Senate. Now, it seems to me that that was the epitome of how you lobby and how you don't lobby. You've got to ask for what you want or you'll never get it. And you've got to push. And indeed, I was prepared, win, lose, or draw. If we could get that recorded vote, that was going to be extremely helpful. And the liars knew it, and they didn't want to be on the short end of that. And so this may come as a surprise to you, but we don't really think there are 67 pro-gun senators. Not in 1996 and not in 2009 when Senator Coburn prevailed on a measure in a similar fashion with a similar dynamic, the same naysayers, different names, but same players, really, saying, don't do it. It's too likely to be a defeat, and we just can't suffer that. And Coburn went ahead and did it and overturned a Reagan-era gun ban in national parks. And last week, the law was changed so that whatever the law of the state in which the park is located, that's the law for carrying and having guns in those national parks. On last report, I looked late last night, the blood was still not flowing in the national parks, and the Bradys probably need a few more tranquilizers, but I think they'll be all right too pretty soon. So we think that that's the way you proceed. There's even a biblical model for this. Senator Dirksen articulated it in his own words that when I feel the heat, I see the light. And of course, we're all for helping them feel the heat. But in Luke 18, there's a widow that goes before an unrighteous judge. No, we don't have any of those today, so it's really not relevant example. But anyway, she went before this unrighteous judge who didn't fear God or man. And whatever it was she was asking for, we're not told, he just blew her off. Now, then, and certainly today, people would say, well, that's the law then. The government has said so. My employee has told me what to do. No, that isn't the way she reacted. She persisted, and she kept coming and coming. And finally, the guy despaired and said, give her what she wants. Quote, she bothers me. She troubles me. If we ever had our own building at Gun Owners of America, I would love to have over the door, we bother them. That's the only way we seem to be able to get their attention, and hopefully we're going to get their attention through some rhino hunting this year. Sounds like most people here have been to the zoo, and so you do know who the rhinos are. These are the Republicans in name only. And if we can take care of them, I think the elections in November may take care of a lot of other problems, but we need to be taking care of problems within the Republican camp now. The Charlie Chris of the world and the Sue Bailey Hutchison, they need to be taken care of. They need to be humiliated. They need to be driven out of public life. We need to reclaim the Republican Party as the conservative party of liberty and limited government. And you can bet that Gun Owners of America are going to be working with you if that is your desire. Morton, there's still a little time. Perhaps I could take some questions.
Absolutely. Questions for Mr. Pratt? You can pick them.
Okay.
Because I'm sure you can handle it.
Well, I'll try. You stay there, though. Don't go too far away.
In Virginia, we've just had some progress. Apparently, we're going to be able to go to restaurants now.
Now, you don't listen to the headlines. The headlines say that guns have been made available for concealed carry holders in bars. Well, actually, Virginia doesn't have bars. If a restaurant doesn't serve over 50% food, then they're going to lose their license for the booze. So, yeah, it looks as if you'll be able to go to a restaurant now carrying your concealed firearm. And, of course, it never was an issue because if it were properly and successfully concealed, then nobody was saying anything about it. And the anomaly of our law in Virginia was that we are one of the so-called open carry states. So if you had it on that hip right there, where I have another holster at the moment, you could walk into the restaurant openly carrying. And this was a campaign that our brothers in Virginia Citizens Defense League have been undertaking for some time. And I would say it's been quite successful. They've been educating the public that guns are not something to be treated with zero tolerance. Ew, it's a gun. And so as they would go into these restaurants, in the initial days of the campaign, calls would come into the cop shop saying, there's a guy in here with a gun. And sometimes they were hassled. The cops would go out and they didn't know the law. They got educated, and now when those calls come in from addled Bradyites, the next question the cops ask is, well, what are they doing? Well, he's having dinner. Oh, well, call us if he's doing anything wrong. So we are making a little progress in Virginia. Yeah.
In the aftermath of Katrina, when guns are being confiscated, going back to your point earlier about we're the bosses, so we can have the guns, and I agree with that, having a bunch myself. But my question is, do we have the will to stand up to the government when they trample our rights? Because turning guns.
That is an exceptionally important point to raise. We can have all the guns in the world, and if we don't have the will to use them, then they are useless. They are as useless, maybe more useless than our golf clubs. At least Tiger Woods' wife found a use for golf clubs. Jeffrey Snyder, years ago, a New York lawyer, wrote a book about a nation of cowards. And he said this very point. If we don't determine that we're going to use them, then they're quite useless to us indeed. And that's, even though I very strongly disagree with the idea that we should submit ourselves to government approval to get a concealed carry permit, I think it has been politically an advance because more people, now that they have government permission, are carrying guns. And that's a good thing because they talk about it. I was in a dentist office yesterday, and I had brought up the point that my wife and I have been watching Chilean television after the earthquake, and there were some women demonstrating in front of a bunch of soldiers protesting the looters who are so evil that they will even burn after they've robbed, burn whole buildings that might still be somewhat standing. And they were chanting to the soldiers, "We want guns, we want guns." And so on my way out, one of the gals behind the desk said, my daughter is in her second class getting a concealed carry permit in Florida. That's a good thing. Yes, sir.
Notwithstanding your position on concealed carry, what do you think of the vote last year on the reciprocity?
There was a measure that was before the Senate that would have said that your concealed carry permit would be recognized the way your driver's license is recognized. And we have chosen to call that a recognition measure rather than reciprocity, because it wasn't setting any standards from Washington, which I think is an important thing to avoid. Washington's a good thing to avoid in general. This measure would have, it was put up by Mr. Thune, meant that you could just go from state to state with your concealed carry permit the way you do with your driver's license now. You don't have to stop at the state line and take a test, prove that you've taken the test at some other time and place. You just go. Now, if the speed limit changes from here to North Carolina, and that won't be too much longer, but right now it's still the law, you have to observe the speed limit changes between states and whatever other changes. Same thing with that recognition law. We'll be back. That's not going to go away.
Yeah, one of the biggest fights that the youth have right now is the right to concealed carry on publicly funded college campuses. With the anticipated purge of rhinos and liberals, if you will, do you see the tide turning on that fight in the next 4 to 6 years?
I think we do have reason to hope that the college campuses will stop being criminal-friendly zones where nut job Obama supporters can go and wipe out tenure-denying colleagues at their university campus. The tragedy is that those people actually practice what they preach, and they sit there defenseless, and they keep getting shot. And, you know, how stuck on stupid is that? So right now, in most states, if you're on a college campus with a concealed carry permit, you're okay because they don't have jurisdiction over you. But if you work there, if you study there, then they can toast you. And that's what's got to stop. Bob Marshall has a measure in the House of Delegates, which I haven't seen move, which would make it so that professors and other personnel employed at the colleges would be able to carry without getting canned. I think we are going to have to wait another election cycle, if for no other reason than the Speaker of the House is a horrible rhino. And until we can get rid of people like him in Richmond, it's going to be very difficult for bills like that to move. For some reason, we've got even a lot of Republicans that have bought into the concept that, well, yeah, I believe in the Second Amendment, but there are some places where guns just don't belong. Really? Well, how come the criminals never get that memo? So,
Larry, I wanted to make a comment. You mentioned Chile. The Leadership Institute has had a strong relation with conservatives in Chile for a long time. I've been down there 19 times, and our best friend and associate there is a fellow named Dario Paya, whom I think you know, and many people here know. He interned here in, I think, 91, and went back, has had a very successful political career there, elected to the Congress for 3 terms in Chile, but he founded the Leadership Institute Chile and does a lot of training. I finally got through to him yesterday, and he, in our conversation, talked about that which you raised, namely enormous mobs of thugs going through residential areas in the devastated portions of Chile, and looting houses, whether they are occupied or not, and beating up and killing people who were there in their own houses. And he said, I am ashamed for my country. I think that
nothing comparable in Haiti, which is really an interesting.
He says that 20 years of left-wing government in Chile have deteriorated the culture to the point where people will do this. He says, however, having spent a lot of time in Virginia, I know that if such a tragedy happened in Virginia, you would not have big mobs running through residential areas, breaking into people's houses, and that is because the people who might be in such mobs would realize that in those houses there would be people who had guns for self-defense. That
Not even hypothetical.
just yesterday, Dario told me that.
20 years ago, a hurricane devastated South Florida, and looters began to pick their way through the ruins, and then all of a sudden it stopped because the folks that were still there had guns, and they used them. And the word got out to the criminal element, this is not the way to go. So, yeah, he's spot on. And what a tragedy that they were denied by their restrictive laws in Chile from being able to easily obtain firearms. There are some people in rural areas that have maybe a .22 or a shotgun, and I'd rather have that than nothing against a thug with a machete. But yeah, I'm glad you. Hopefully, he'll see that this produces a movement for gun ownership in Chile, legislatively as well as popular demand. Yes, sir.
Would you talk a little bit about the difference in charter between Gun Owners of America and the NRA?
Well, the difference between the two groups, other than 100 years and size, is probably that illustration that I gave using Senator Smith, that I guess all too often their philosophy is nothing ventured, nothing lost. The American ethos has typically been, at least until socialism eats us away, nothing ventured, nothing gained. We're always up for making an attempt, trying. And it's that can-do attitude that I think permeates us. It's that desire to follow the lead of the widow in Luke 18 that is not typically present in the thinking at the NRA. In many states, they're quietly trying to suppress the movement for the Firearms Freedoms Act. By the way, I forgot to mention, but the one in Wyoming is our favorite. I'm not sure what happened yesterday or what's going to happen today, but I think today's the third reading in the Senate of a House-approved bill that not only says if the gun's made in Wyoming, feds butt out, and if you butt in, we're going to put you in jail. Now that's a neat piece of legislation. Talk about the 10th Amendment. So, and that's the kind of stuff we've been supporting. We shopped looking when we saw that somebody in New Hampshire had a measure like that in that not so likely legislature. We shopped around hoping that other sponsors, even if they'd already dropped their bill in, would follow suit. Well, the guy in Wyoming actually politically elbowed out of the way the more standard version, a milder version where it just says it's illegal, and put his bill in, and that's the one that's going through the legislature. The head of the Senate tried to kill it, and we think we have helped him see the light, and so today may be the day that Wyoming takes the lead in freedom.
Up to two more questions.
One right behind you.
With the progress that we've made with the state park ruling, would that not set a precedent for state colleges?
Of course, parks are different. You know, when the liberals don't have an argument, you're either a racist or that's different. And so we're going to have to fight the fight. I mean, look, we've got 48 states that at least have some kind of concealed carry law. And yet every time another state has had this kind of legislation introduced for concealed carry, it's as if the people of that state are so different from all the other states that already have these systems. and you hear about the road rage and the bar brawls that are going to erupt and just lead to mayhem. It never happens, of course. Au contraire, crime goes down. But these opponents of ours are shameless or stuck on stupid, or both. And so they reiterate the same arguments. And so I wish I could say, well, of course, your point's well taken. But not for them, it's not. In the back.
I'm from the great state of Tennessee, where we passed a Firearms Freedom Act. And the ATF sent us a letter and said, it's very pleasant of you to do this, but we don't care what you're doing. What's your response to that, and what's your position, I guess?
That's a great 10th Amendment question to end on. The ATF sent a letter to licensed dealers and manufacturers, presumably precisely the people who will not be involved in the Firearms Freedom Act, because you don't need a license in order to make a gun or sell a gun. So they didn't really know who to write the letter to. They should have written it to everybody in Tennessee. The real issue, and that's where your question goes, is going to come to what happens when the ABC Metal Shop is making a 1911 45 cal and starts to sell it. Now, hopefully, he's going to have located in a county where he knows the sheriff and what kind of sheriff he has, and hopefully he probably have a little button like bank tellers do right about here, so that when it hits the fan and the boys in blue come in from Washington, bzzzt, and the sheriff about a block away will be over to help him out. Now, the sheriff in most states right now is the chief law enforcement officer, and if he has the determination, goes back to whether we want to use our guns or not, if he is willing, right now, he can can these guys. There was a fire in a rural county outside of Memphis not too long ago in a barn. Had a lot of ammo and powder. And the fire department was there, and they were taking care of business. There were even a couple of sheriff's deputies. I guess it was a big enough fire, they just wanted to make sure everything stayed calm. And lo and behold, some FBI agents showed up and announced that they were taking over the investigation. And the deputy said, "What investigation?" And the FBI guy said, "Well, there's ammo involved, and so we're taking over the investigation." Well, they knew their sheriff had a kind of an attitude about the feds, such as he had never taken a nickel of federal law enforcement funding. If he needed money bad enough, he'd literally have a bake sale. So they called the sheriff, and he was out there in a flash, and he ascertained what was going on, and he said, "Well, I don't think you ought to be doing this investigation, but if you insist, I can give you some office space in my building downtown." "No, well, we just stay here, we'll do this." Fellas, I don't think you understood what I was saying. You're either going to get out of my county right now, or I'm going to put your blanks right in my 4x8 cells. You don't talk to federales that way. And they called their supervisor, and the supervisor used a general article notice saying, well, a sheriff can do that, like any sheriff can do that. And knowing that sheriff, he probably will. They left, and you know what? The county took care of the problem just fine. That's how we're going to have to handle it, because the courts are not going to rule in our favor. The courts are an appendage of the usurpation of federal power, and they almost never vote right. But we don't need the courts. They are not the last word. We are in the ballot box, hopefully.
Larry, thank you very much. You did not disappoint. I knew it was going to be an interesting and exciting presentation. As a token of our appreciation, let me present to you one of the Leadership Institute's lovely Adam Smith ties. This is our newest model of tie.
That is great. Thank you. I've wanted one of these for a long time. I should have asked to come over.
Yes, yes, yes. Well, they are also available for sale. I invite everyone to join us next month, Wednesday, April 7th, our next Wednesday Wake Up Club breakfast. And on May the 5th, we have our breakfast featuring Senator Jim DeMint, and that will be of interest to you. If any of you are interested in the purchase of Adam Smith ties, or other scarves or other pieces of Adam Smith merchandise for which we are the sole producer and distributor in the United States, see my assistant Kathy Graham. She's up on the 5th floor. Encourage you to do that. And anyone who is interested in taking a wonderfully escorted tour of the Institute from top to bottom should meet Seth Nichols at the lectern here. Seth, where are you here? This is Seth. He'll be up here and would be happy to take you through and show you every nook and cranny of interest here at the Leadership Institute. Thank you all for coming, and good day.